behalf of the Farnsworth Art Museum, welcome. I'm Christopher Brownwell, Director of the museum, and delighted you could join us today for today's discussion. To the Edge of What's Possible, the Art and Life of Dale Chihuly. Dale Chihuly is widely regarded as one of the world's greatest living artists in glass. Again and again, he's pushed the boundaries of glass as an art form to produce objects unlike anything we've seen before. Art historian Henry Adams has been working for the last 3 years on a biography of Chihuly. And today, Henry will lead us through sort of the artist's creative process and the ways in which his art draws on the unique properties of glass. Now, about today's speaker. Henry Adams, a graduate of Harvard College and received his MA and PhD from Yale, where he received the Francis Blanchard Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in art history. Henry's currently professor of American art at Case Western Reserve University. In addition, he's held other teaching posts, including the University of Kansas, the University of Pittsburgh, and Colorado College, just to name a few. He's also served in museums, including curator of American art at the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Kemper Museum, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. He's written extensively and contributed to over 450 publications, including several books that he's authored, including Tom and Jack, The Intertwined Lives of Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock, Aikens Revealed, Andrew Wyeth, Master Drawings from the Artist Collection, and today's topic, Chihuly, On Fire, Fire, Breath, and Light. Now it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Henry Adams. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you, Chris. And it's always a pleasure to talk at the Farnsworth Museum. It's really a model American museum, and I think really produces at the level of much larger museums. Michael Komenecki seems to continually come out with wonderful publications, and of course you just got written up in the New York Times. Let me talk a little bit about my work on Dale Chihuly. Now I'm trying to figure out how I get so I can can you see it now?
Yeah, it looks good.
Yep.
Okay, terrific. I first got involved with Dale Chihuly when I was interim director at the Kemper Museum, and that was when Dale did his project on Chihuly over Venice. I put a catalog on his work at that time, and then shortly after that went on to Cleveland, thought no more about it for, I hate to think how many years, because it would reveal how old I am. But anyway, out of the blue, I got a call from the Chihuly studio that they wanted to update a book on Dale's work. And so I wrote Chihuly on Fire, which is basically an account of Dale's blown glass forms. And somehow the process of working on that project led into the notion of doing a full-scale biography of Dale Chihuly. What's surprising about Chihuly, there are lots of books and publications about his work, but they tend to be celebrating particular projects, so that there really at this point isn't any full account of his whole career. And I think that Dale is a kind of fascinating figure. Here he is with the Queen of England at the opening of a show at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is the world's largest museum of decorative arts, and he's showing her this chandelier that he did for the main atrium. It's amazing that he has achieved this from actually a very modest background in Tacoma, Washington, and a number of setbacks as a child that I think would have finished off the career of any normal human being. Here is Dale as a small child in Tacoma, and Tacoma is basically, well, it's not too far from Seattle. It's got beautiful views of Mount Rainier, but at that point it was a very industrial town with the major business there was a rather toxic copper smelting plant. Dale's dad was a butcher who then got involved with labor organizing. Here's Dale with his older brother and his mom and dad. Here he is with his brother. And when he was in his early teens, there were two major tragedies in his life. One is that his brother was killed in an Air Force plane crash in Florida, which very much traumatized the family. And just a year later, his father died of a heart attack. So basically, Dale and his mom were left to fend for themselves. His mother had literally never written a check before, went to work as a bartender. Dale did all kinds of odd jobs, from setting bowling pins to working in a meat packing factory. Dale didn't want to go to college. His mother insisted that he do so. And through a kind of roundabout route, he got involved with art and particularly with interior decoration. And I think that's interesting because one of the traits of Dale's work is his understanding of the total environment in which he places his work. So he not only does amazing work in glass, but always has had a great sense of how to light it, how to show it off. It was as a student at the University of Washington that he first got involved with glass in kind of an unusual way. He was taking a weaving class and given the assignment of combining weaving with some other unusual material. And he chose glass, made weavings in which bits of glass are held in. And then around that time, he also blew his first bubble in glass, which was a sort of transformative experience for him. He was just using an ordinary plumber's pipe. Glass is very hot. It needs to get above 2,000 degrees to melt. And as you probably know, paper burns at Fahrenheit 451. So you're talking about something that's really quite hot for that to happen. Anyway, that was a transformative experience for him to see the material change and become. Glass has very unusual properties of viscosity, where it changes from solid to fluid in a rather gradual way, so that you can get it very liquid or to a sort of honey viscosity or to nearly solid. At that point, Dale went to work for an architect in Seattle, John Graham, the guy who did the Seattle Space Needle. But he had gotten hooked on glass and basically decided to go to the University of Wisconsin to study with Harvey Littleton, who had basically created the first glass program in the United States. To get the money to do this, Dale worked for a summer on a salmon fishing boat and was basically going 40 miles offshore salmon fishing. It turns out that salmon fishing is the most dangerous occupation in the United States, but for that reason it's paid quite well. Harvey Littleton basically created the studio glass movement. Harvey was the son of a research chemist at the Corning Company in Corning, New York, and turned to the arts. At first worked with pottery, but sort of had glass in his blood. Man has made glass for about 5,000 years. The blowpipe was first introduced about 100 AD, which made it possible to shape things in glass. Basically, in the 19th century, people worked out very elaborate machinery for doing things like creating bottles and practical objects out of glass. But glass was not favored as an artistic material because it was thought that it was so difficult to work with that an individual artist could not work with it. It could only be done in a factory situation. Harvey Littleton basically set out to change that fact. He had a number of technical problems to resolve. The basic one was how you make a furnace, which is compact in size, so that it can be used by an individual glass blower. And there are also problems of annealing and various problems of that sort to work out. Anyway, Harvey basically worked out the practical issues of making it so that one artist or a small team of artists could work with glass in an artistic way. And I think what's interesting is that while glass was, as I've said, it's a material about 5,000 years old, the idea of approaching it as an artistic medium rather than a practical medium had really not been explored very thoroughly. Now, everything about glass is basically a matter of shaping the bubble. You basically start off with the gather, which you basically dip the blowpipe into a furnace, gather up a blob of glass, then you blow the bubble. You gradually increase the bubble in size, and as you do that, you need to periodically reheat the bubble because it cools in just a little bit more than a minute, so that you basically need to work with the material very quickly. Here it's being reheated in a furnace, but you can also, to some extent, reheat it with a torch. And basically, the art of glass is that of shaping the bubble, which you can do in various ways. You can roll it on a marvering table, basically a steel table. You can shape it in a wooden mold. And then a key moment in creating objects out of glass is when you transfer the bubble from the blowpipe to what's known as the punty. You're basically at the bottom of the shape, you're attaching another steel rod, and then you basically, here you're shaping the bubble, but it's basically so that you can take where the blowpipe was and start to open up the opening where the blowpipe was and shape the bubble in various ways, which you can do you can actually do it by hand with wet newspaper. You can shape it with tongs. You can cut it with scissors. And you can also add color in various ways, adding speckles of color, what are known as jimmies, after the jimmies that you put on ice cream cones. You can also apply a spiral wrap where you turn the bubble and apply a thread of glass to it. And Dale very quickly figured out that glass blowing not only makes beautiful things, but is great spectacle. And that's been one of the keys to his success as an artist. Now, interestingly, Dale's first phase was mostly installations and experimental work. And today, because he's been so successful, Dale is often accused of being a purely commercial artist, but in fact, for 10 years early in his career, he worked as a teacher at the Rhode Island School of Design and basically only sold very small amounts of his work. During this period, he worked a good deal with one of his students, Jamie Carpenter, who has gone on to be the world's leading expert in architectural glass. He's the person who did the glass for the pyramid at the Louvre, for the World Trade Center, and this is the Fulton Street subway stop that he did in New York, where he did this extraordinary glass dome that using special treated and reflective glass surfaces to bring skylight down into this very deep basement level. During this period, Dale and Jamie were blowing very freeform experimental things. They were also creating things that were larger than anything done before. They were often doing things like standing on ladders so that they could blow tubes that were 7 or 8 feet long. And this period of experimental work culminated in a large installation about 20 or 30 feet long called Glass Forest, which was a series of these glass tubes that were injected with neon. This was really one of the first times that people had ever used glass not to make a sort of desktop object like an ashtray or a glass for water or whatever, but to really create an environmental statement. And during this period, he and Jamie also did installations where they placed neon in melting ice, and basically as the ice melted, the color of the neon would change. Lots of technical problems in doing this, and in fact, Jamie nearly electrocuted himself at various points. And using fairly sophisticated technology, using something called a Tesla coil, so that you basically could illuminate these tubes, without the usual hookups. During this period, Dale came up with the idea of creating a kind of counterculture art school out in the Northwest, what became the Pilchuck School, which started off as something very much in the manner of a hippie commune, where basically students went out there and were living in tents and building their own tree houses, and basically, developing a glass blowing studio from the ground up. Rather miraculously, this became the world's leading school in the world for learning to blow glass, and has been a key to Dale's work in the later phase of his career. Starting in, I guess, the 1970s, Dale started to move from these large-scale installations to works in which he was creating blown glass forms in which he shaped the bubble in a series of unusual ways. The first of these were a group of glass cylinders, which were basically quite large compared to what had been made in glass before, and where basically he rolled the cylinder over glass threads to create something like a painting. And here you get into the art world controversies of the time. This was a period when people were arguing a great deal as to whether painting should be flat or illusionistic, and Clement Greenberg was arguing that the goal of painting was to become flatter and flatter. Here you have a painting, but it's on a curved three-dimensional surface. And many of these glass cylinders took imagery from Navajo blankets. Here you can see Dale rolling a glass cylinder. And he worked a great deal with a woman named Flora Mace, who proved to be a virtuoso at creating drawings with glass threads. Here you can see this is basically a technique of drawing, painting, not unlike printing in some way, but something that was of no interest to a factory because there are so many unpredictable variables that every work comes out differently. Basically, when you roll the cylinder over the threads melt and are embedded in the cylinder to different degrees so that they create these wonderful sort of illusionistic patterns where they're partly on the surface and partly in depth. By this time, Dale had begun collecting Pendleton blankets and was also very interested in Navajo blankets. Dale is quite a collector. It turns out he has the world's largest collection of Pendletons, and here I'm just showing you part of his collection and to give a sense of how these cylinders are inspired by it.
Henry, can I interrupt here for a second? We're having a lot of trouble with your sound.
Oh, okay. I'll try to move.
In and out of being very clear. And so I'm just wondering if your assistant might be available to just
Well, I think I'm moving back and forth, so I'll stay closer to the screen.
And even when you turn away, it seems to be, we seem to be losing you.
Dale was in a terrible car accident in 1975. He was with a friend of his on a lecture tour in England, where he was going to have an exhibition of his Navajo blanket cylinders. He and Seaver Leslie were on the way to see the English pop artist Peter Blake, who probably many of you are not familiar with the name, but you're familiar with the album cover he designed for Sgt. Pepper. On the way, there was this terrible accident where basically they went into a roundabout the wrong way, went head on into another car. I'm terrible on numbers, but my recollection is that Dale had over 200 stitches in his face and also lost the use of his left eye. This clearly was establishing a lot of difficulties for his career because glass blowing requires a lot of three-dimensional perception. Here's Dale back in Providence right after the accident, looking rather subdued. Basically, Dale tried to take up glass blowing, but he didn't have full three-dimensional vision, so that it was difficult for him to do seemingly simple things like to take the glass in and out of the furnace. But interestingly, at this point, he basically shifted from working individually, blowing the work himself, to managing a small team of artists working under his direction. This is something that he had seen in Venice, in Murano. And interestingly, this is the point at which Dale broke loose as an artist. That this losing an eye, which would have probably finished off the career of most glassblowers, ended up being a kind of breakthrough for him. And his breakthrough work in many ways were the baskets, which are seemingly very simple, but were doing something that had basically never been done in glass before. He was inspired by Northwest Coast Indian baskets, which he saw at the Historical Museum in Tacoma, which were often sort of loose and floppy. And he came up with the idea of doing something similar in glass. Seems like a simple idea, but this is the first time that an artist in glass had systematically begun to explore asymmetry. And it's also exploring danger in a way. Basically, what Dale is doing is pushing the form to the point of collapse, but then stopping that process just at the point when it's about to fold in on itself. Here's his first show of baskets, where he took a galvanized metal table, let it sit outside to get rusty, and displayed 100 baskets on it. One of the interesting aspects of the baskets is he began to put baskets inside each other, so that he's creating sculpture, but a kind of sculpture that had never been created before, where artists like Henry Moore had explored things like creating holes in sculpture, but here you're using the unique properties of glass to create a kind of sculpture unattainable in any other medium, and very expressive. I think it's hard to look at these things without thinking about birth and embryos and things of that sort. He went on to the C forms, which basically he was taking Venetian techniques of decoration, this kind of filigree decoration that you find on Venetian glass of the Renaissance, but using it on forms that were much more fluid. And here he was in some ways exploring the asymmetrical possibilities of glass to an even greater degree. The technical challenge of making these is that basically they need to be perfectly symmetrical up until the last stage, when you let the form collapse upon itself. And to do these, you use something called an optic mode, where basically it's creating ribs on the surface of the glass that allow you to blow the glass extraordinarily thin and create very, how would I say, almost seaweed-like shapes in glass. It's hard to look at these so-called sea forms without feeling that you're at the bottom of the sea and you're watching these glass shapes being rippling in the ocean currents. He went on to the Persians. Here he was working with a wonderfully manic ADHD glassblower named Martin Blank, who loved to make experimental forms. Here he was playing a great deal with the idea of doing a lip wrap and then creating all kinds of forms in which you, how would I say, these feel like Persian vessels that have been buried in the desert. Then finally we come to the macchia, where up to this point he hadn't done this much with color. With the macchia, he decided, basically this was the point at which he started using Kugler colors. I think there are 200 or 300 Kugler colors. Dale decided that he was going to use all of them, and also was going to use contrasting colors on the inside and the outside of the vessel. Basically, to prevent it from becoming muddy, what you need to do is put a layer of milky white glass between the two layers of color. And I think what's fascinating about the macchia is that when you see it in one form of light, you see the opaque surface. When the light is going through it, the two colors blend in unusual ways. These were also some of the largest blown forms that had been made up to The final series was the Venetians, where he basically took up the challenge of working with two famous Venetian glass-blowing virtuosos, Lino Tagliapietra and Lino Signoretto. The idea here was, here's Lino at work, extraordinary virtuoso who knew an amazing range of glass-blowing techniques. Dale started off by being inspired by Italian glass vessels of the 1930s by people like Carlo Scarpa and Napoleone Martinuzzi. But he basically pushed what they had done to a greater level of extravagance. These were the first glass forms that Dale had done where he's working not only with the shape itself, but with attachments to it. He would basically make drawings in the glass shop while Lino was at work. And when Lino finished one piece, he would have a drawing of what to make next. I think what's interesting is that there's an extraordinary interplay between these two artists to do things of a sort that had never been done in glass before. Dale needed to know what Lino was capable of doing, but often Dale's drawings were presenting technical challenges that had things that had never been done in glass before, where Lino needed to look at the drawing and figure out, you have the devil, am I going to do that? At this point, he's working with quite a large team of glass blowers. To do this sort of thing, you basically need to have a team that is producing each of these pieces. You need to get them all to exactly the same temperature and put them together in the space of a few minutes. In this period, Dale is also doing wonderful drawings, which are kind of an outgrowth of this process of making drawings to show Lino what to do. Dale's third phase came when he was invited to do a major exhibition of his work at the Seattle Art Museum by Patterson Sims. Patterson Sims was not all that crazy about Dale's individual glass shapes, which he thought were too much like gift shop items, but he was more interested in Dale's conceptual work of the 1960s. And this is the point at which Dale basically combined these two phases of his career and started to make extraordinary glass environments. This is his C-form ceiling, which is like walking underwater. Interestingly, this was inspired by a temple in Japan where basically there was a priest in Japan who was collecting Dale's glass, and because he didn't have very much space to show them, he created a glass floor and put Dale's glass pieces underneath the floor. At the Seattle Museum, Dale initially was going to do a glass floor, and then he realized that it would be easy for people to stumble on it, and he thought, well, why don't we put it on the ceiling? And at Bellagio in Las Vegas, Dale created an extraordinary ceiling, which has literally thousands of pieces of glass in it. In this period, Dale started to make glass chandeliers. The first of them was made for the Seattle show, and then he's gone on to place them in a variety of buildings worldwide. And this is the gutsy side of Dale. Basically, Dale made chandeliers for 3 years before anyone would buy them, and then for reasons that are hard to figure out, they took off, and you now find them in museums and residences around the world, and even in the yachts of very affluent people. In this period, Dale also started to do something that had never been done before, which is to create permanent outdoor installations out of glass. And this is a chandelier he created at Icicle Creek in upstate Washington, which basically is, it's in a post which is drilled into this natural rock. One of the amazing things is seeing this piece in winter. There are actually little heaters that are installed so that, but Dale actually did freezer tests with the glass chandelier parts to make sure that they would hold up to the weather. And in fact, they've successfully held up for many years at this point. And this led on to a series of glass spectaculars. The first of them was Chihuly over Venice in 1995, where he hung his glass chandeliers over the canals of Venice. This was kind of a brazen thing to do. Dale is basically going back to the world center of glass blowing for nearly 1,000 years to show off, basically putting his work up against 1,000 years of glass blowing in Venice. Yeah, I'm just showing you, he did a lot of fax drawings at this point to stay in touch with his studio. And he has this wonderful sort of way of tipping his handwriting so that his letters always look a little like a tornado. And basically for Chihuly over Venice, he blew glass at 3 factories around the world. It was at Nuutijärvi, Finland, that he actually first began to experiment with the outdoor installation of glass. Here are some of the chandeliers that were on view at Chihuly over Venice. And this is actually not a chandelier, but a glass tower. Basically, Dale's chandelier turned upside down and made into a tower is complementing an 18th century Venetian chandelier, which is hanging from the ceiling of the Venetian palace in St. Mark's. And I think what is marvelous about Dale's work, which is unusual for a contemporary artist, is how well his work complements other styles of architecture, other styles of art. And here is Chihuly over Jerusalem, a major spectacular in the year 2000, where he created glass towers. Here he is with a over 40-foot blue glass tower. This is Garfield Park, where he basically created a new art form, mixing glass in a botanical garden to create a dialogue between his glass shapes and natural forms, and actually has ended up transforming the way botanical gardens operate. This was one of the first sort of major glass spectacles at a botanical garden. Here are some more of his outdoor installations. This is at Chatsworth House in England. And I have just a few slides of the boathouse, which is where Dale does his work. It's where he has his glass blowing factory studio, and the front of the boathouse is this extraordinary room that looks out on Lake Washington, which has a 66-foot table that runs down the full length of the room, and this is where Dale often exhibits his most recent work and sort of has a chance to evaluate it himself. Here I'm just showing you some rooms in the boathouse. This is the aquarium room. This is Dale's swimming pool, which is wonderful. It's like the seaform ceiling, except that it's basically at the base of the pool. And one of the wonderful things about this is that as the water ripples, it creates extraordinary visual effects. Dale is quite a collector and has always been inspired by collections. This is his Northwest room with the birch bark canoe, with part of his Pendleton collection, part of his Northwest baskets collection. As I mentioned, he has the world's largest collection of Pendletons. Here on the left, you are seeing part of Dale's matchbook collection. Not a very good slide, I'm afraid. Dale likes to collect in quantity, and he also likes to collect collections. He recently, for example, bought a collection of 1,000 can openers. And very often something like a can opener, if you're looking at just one of them, it's not that interesting. But if you've got 1,000, you suddenly have a new insight into all the things a can opener can do. If you want to see Dale's work, there are a lot of places to see it, but the best place is probably Chihuly Garden and Glass at the base of the Seattle Space Needle, which is basically an exhibition that runs through all the different kinds of work he's produced over his career. It's really quite an extraordinary spectacle. And one of the highlights is that there's a little cafe called the Collections Cafe, where every table has a glass top where you can look in to some different kind of object that Dale has collected. Here what you're seeing are string holders, where they used to have these faces with string coming out of the mouth. This is before Scotch tape was invented, but there are other tables that have things like inkwells and doll furniture and Bakelite jewelry and just about everything you can think of. Yeah, and I just think it's amusing that, Dale, when he just graduated from college, worked for the architect who designed the Seattle Space Needle, and you wonder if he had any clue at that point that he would have this big museum at the base of it. So that's kind of a quick introduction to Dale Chihuly, and I don't know if there are questions, and I'm also hoping that Dale and Richard will dive in and give some of their own thoughts about what we've just run through.
Thank you, Henry. There was a question about the weaving, the date of that, the woven panel with glass. What was the date of the woven panel?
Those are the early 1970s, and he did not a huge number, but I think he did half a dozen of those. The major one was one that hung in his mother's home for many years, and that she grew very fond of, and when people requested it for exhibition, she would always say no, because she wanted it to look at home. And of course, how would I say, I think it's very interesting, the idea of weaving glass, and then Dale takes that up later with his glass thread drawings. I might say that one of Dale's pupils, Toots Zinski, has also worked with glass threads in a very creative way, and basically created a kind of glass object that never existed before.
Thank you. There were also some questions about the role of improvisation in the creation of his work.
I think that's very interesting, and one could um, I mean, how would I say it? Dale is at a far extreme in two regards. The nature of glassblowing is to learn it, you need to do repetitive operations over and over again until you learn to do them perfectly. So that there's a big element of repetition in glassblowing. But I guess that Dale has always also been a master of taking advantage of accident. And one of the things he did early in his career, which was very unusual, is that he would basically take his team on the road and take them to unfamiliar glassblowing studios, often with very bad equipment. And he basically found that the challenge of facing unexpected situations and having to improvise led to a kind of creativity that you didn't get otherwise. And certainly in his early years, RISD, Dale was doing very experimental things with, pouring glass, on the sand in the beach and that kind of thing. Basically exploring its qualities of, flow and how it bubbles and things like that.
In terms of the spontaneity, sometimes when you're making a piece and you can see there's an accident happening, Dale would often let that accident continue because there was a certain flow and grace to that. If you tried to use some technique to sort of jam it back into the direction you had initially, it isn't going to give you something new and interesting. So I
think the basket.
I think often Dale he saw one of his team blowing something and it was like getting off. You just go with it. Let's just see where this takes us.
I think that the baskets are a classic example where it's this funny combination of precision and unpredictability, because it's very difficult to make a basket that is going to start to collapse but doesn't completely collapse. And you never quite.
And the one thing with all of the glass he's working on, all of those colors have different properties. Some soften at an early temperature and they affect the way the piece moves. Some are much stiffer. And so Dale will put all these colors together, but they don't always behave the way you would expect.
He would choreograph.
Yeah.
He would choreograph accidents to happen. And I think at RISD and Pilchuck, all the other places, dance, music, popular culture, food, film, nature, it was all mixed together, and it was really exciting. So he would combine a lot of similar and dissimilar elements. And
Eric was saying earlier on that Dale often plays loud rock and roll when his team is blowing glass, but in a way you can think of what they're doing as a dance party. It's loosely choreographed movement. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about Dale's team is the way they respond to each other, which is very complicated. All of them are skilled enough as glassblowers that they know exactly when they're needed to move in, and there are a lot of great technical challenges to keeping the heat right and keeping the shape right and getting the pieces to fit together and so forth. Yeah.
It was improvisation. It was jazz, visual jazz and dance. And it was, having the music loud was always a big part of it. And you were kind of in this other plane. It was happening. It is here. It is now. It's a performance. It's choreographed. It's accidental. It's improvisational. And it reflects a lot of that, all that motion.
We had another question about when you were talking about the Chihuly garden in glass. Where is it and what does it contain? Your audio was cut out there.
That's in Seattle, and that's just below the Space Needle in Seattle, so it's not too hard to find because you can see the Space Needle from just about anywhere in Seattle. That used to be a kind of slightly seedy amusement park, and there was great controversy when it was leased to Dale and a group of financiers to make it a sort of Chihuly museum. I think it's the most popular attraction in Seattle now. It outdraws the Seattle Art Museum, which is something that I'm not supposed to officially know. And it's been listed as one of the 10 best museums in the world. I'm trying to remember which tourist outfit it was that listed it, but it's sort of amazing. You've got the places like the Louvre and the National Gallery, and then you've got Dale's Garden in Glass as the 10 museums in the world that you don't want to miss.
And it's right next to the Jimi Hendrix Museum.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. I talked to Dale the other day and just said, is there anything you would like me to present or say about this presentation? And the first thing he came up with like that was Maine. I love Maine, and he's had a lot of influences here in Maine from when he was in Providence. Haystack was a big influence in the making of Pilchuck. And Fran Merritt, the director of Haystack, was a very strong mentor for Dale. And again, Fran did similar things. He let people be themselves and do things. And Dale picked up on that. And then he took, instead of a multimedia arts and crafts camp studio, he did the Pilchuck, all about glass, 50 years ago, coming right up, 2021. So that's pretty big. He's had pieces in the Farnsworth Museum, Portland Museum. He's done some work at USM, prints with Richard Wilson in Portland. So Steve Leslie's just down the road. Jamie Carpenter and I both live on North Haven, and he used to come to see us more. So it's a big, there's definitely a Maine connection here, which he wanted to make sure more people knew about.
Thanks, Eric. We have another question about how did he dispose of all the toxic materials used to make glass? Would any of you know about that?
I think you'd have to know which era you're speaking of. Nowadays, the colored rods, those metals, and you have to understand that it's the metals that give glass the color. So those metals are fused in the glass, so they're inert. So there really isn't anything toxic. Like some painters use a cadmium yellow. With glass, it's different. A cadmium yellow it's bonded to the glass, so it's not a hazard.
But we used to do a lot of things like spraying metals, stannous chloride on the outside and to fume, give it that iridescent look. And this would be wafting up in the glass shop, and lousy ventilation. And earlier Richard was talking about the batch would be down 2 stories below the street in Providence with cullet, and we'd be making up bags of broken glass cullet, adding different chemicals to it. And we'd start with masks on, or maybe just dumb paper masks, but shirts. And it was hot down there, and we'd just kind of slowly take layers off and get rid of the masks, and the glasses would steam up, and we just would do all this stuff, and we're still kicking.
Yeah, I guess I'd say that, it is in that period, and the glass people seem to have been lucky, but, Art Wood died early of cancer, and probably because of bad ventilation that was being used in that period. And there are a number of the ceramics people who had problems with cancer or being poisoned in some way.
Well, Connie Leslie with the
Yeah. Yeah. This is certainly a way at which artists have become smarter than they used to be. And, you know, painters used to use lead white and then lick their fingers, and that's not recommended. I think you can't even get lead white anymore.
We have another question about whether Chihuly's studio is currently functioning. Has the virus affected the work he does or the way he works?
Eric might know more about this than I do, but my understanding is that it closed down for a while and it's now working, but at a rather limited pace.
That's the same thing I understand. I was out there in Seattle most of this past winter and spring, and I was going to go down to see him, and the virus hit, and that was it. And I talked to him the other day, and he said his son Jackson is now working at the boathouse in the glass shop, in the hot shop, as part of the team, and that was a big thing. So he's doing a lot of he's always doing new things. That's what he does.
Yeah, I think what's amazing about Dale is that, and it makes it hard to write a book about him, because as soon as you think you've got the end to the book, he does something new that sets his career off in a new direction. Yeah, he is still making very creative stuff, though, I mean, I think like all of us, he's been very much affected by the COVID pandemic.
And we have one final question. It looks like a couple of attendees have mentioned that the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has had an exhibition of his work, and of course they still have the two-story green tree there on exhibit. But would you know how many years did that exhibit span? Was there, and there were a number of styles in it, as the attendee has mentioned. Would anyone want to take?
Wasn't it about 4 years ago?
I was thinking, I think it's around 2012 or something like that. I'm not sure. It seems to me. And again, it did have a lot of elements, different parts.
I guess I would say that, yes, that was sort of a major breakthrough in Dale's work. And I'm trying to remember the exact list of museums, but there were 4 major museums that, how would I say? Dale has yet to have a show at the Museum of Modern Art, but he's come up to the next best level. And it was a major breakthrough when San Francisco and Baltimore and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston did a major show of his work. And of course, the big glass tower in Boston, I think, is a wonderful statement. And this is one of the interesting things about Dale that I find even a little mysterious. With many modern artists, to make their work look good, you need to take away everything else and put it in a white space. Dale's work somehow speaks in almost any environment, and he is very brilliant in his ability to take just about any architectural space and to figure out how to use glass in dialogue with it.
He's described as a glass artist, and he is all of that, but I think it goes a lot more beyond just a glass artist. He's a maestro of creation, and that's what artists do. They create things, and he keeps on and keeps on. And so the connection with the architecture, the paintings, the culture, all of that. So I would say he's an artist, the maestro.
And I might add one other thing that's a little bit unusual. If you ask the general public, most people who are not art connoisseurs don't like abstract art that much. And Dale makes abstract art, and it seems to speak to everybody. And this would be a sort of another art historical speech, but there's a lot of connections between Dale's work and that of some of the very radical and innovative earth artists and abstract artists, people like Robert Smithson and Richard Serra. He's very much connected with that tradition at the same time that he's turned it in a very personal direction.
Years ago, when I was visiting Dale in Seattle, he would make little maquettes or models of a room where his work would be exhibited. And I think he must have gotten some lamp workers to do little miniature glass pieces so he could stick them, you know, with cardboard in the sort of mocked up room. So Dale just didn't throw this stuff into a blank space. He really looked at how those pieces would be represented, how they would look in a small model, and whether that would transpose to something larger. So he was careful at planning a lot of this.
I might throw out a comment there, which is if you go to the Boathouse in Seattle, for every project Dale does, he does a full-scale mock-up, so that basically it looks very spontaneous and accidental, but he's really thought through all these projects from every possible angle and tested them before he does the final installation.
And it's very much designed, it's intentional, it has a lot of room to move. Photography has always played a big part. He said he doesn't really, especially in those early basket type days, he didn't care so much about owning and keeping the pieces. People always ask, well, don't you miss it when you sell it? He said, I like the image. I want to keep the image. The photograph of it is what counts to me. And he worked with lots of photographers, both as photographers of the work itself, but Harry Callahan's and the Aaron Siskins. And he would bring in all kinds of artists at different schools, Pilchucks, in his different teams. He would integrate a lot of different kind of artists, creative people all the way around, and let them be themselves. It'd be more than just someone making a Chihuly for a Chihuly. He would make this new alloy, basically.
And one final question. Is there a list of where his permanent installations are?
You know, that's a good question. I know there's a list of museums that have his work. So sometimes they might have work in their collection, but not on view. Most of the books about Dale's work have a list in the back of places where you can see it. But that's actually a good thought for actually the book I'm doing, which is written in rough form, but it's going to need a lot of editing and designing and so forth. But we should really put a list in the back of the best places to see Dale's work.
I'm sure the website will have some of that as well, or you could contact.
Well, I'm really grateful to all of you for being here today. Thank you to our participants, our presenter, Henry Adams, and Eric Hopkins and Richard Remsen for joining in. And I want to thank everyone who's attended and so appreciate your comments and questions. And people are very much appreciative and are thanking you also for your presentation, Henry, and for all of your insights, Eric and Richard. So we'll to be continued, perhaps, right?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Eric and Richard, and I learned things that I didn't know before today, so that's always fun.
All right. Well,
yeah, thank you.
Right, well, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, all right, then we'll sign off for now.